Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland. Hello and welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. This week we are on episode 47. I'm not sure how we keep going with this. It's quite amazing. Who would have thought there'd be that many people that were experts and really interesting speakers that would want to speak to us for this podcast?
I know, and we still have so many to go, Zoe. We've got already about 6 recorded, 5 or 6, and with a long list of other experts to speak to.
Holy moly. Well, tonight's one's a good one. Tonight is, they're all good ones, but tonight's a good one. We're going to be speaking to Matthew Bridson, who's very interesting, but more about him anon. Because first of all, Claire, I was just wondering, is there anything in the news?
Well, Zoe, I'm just going to skip over the fact that we're going to pretend that there isn't something in the news. There is something in the news.
What is it?
Yeah, well, we were contacted by quite a few people to tell us about a statue which has been put up in France. It's a statue to a woman called Henriette de Crans, who was burned alive for witchcraft. And a bust has been made and put up in, and I'm going to mangle this name, I'm afraid, Bessacon. The bust of Henriette de Crans, and it's a lovely, just a woman's head and sort of the top half of her body, has been erected. It's the first woman accused of witchcraft, and very sadly, her fate was that she was burnt alive in Bessacon. This has been installed in a village called Chamars. It was inaugurated on Saturday, November the 20th. The artist who put up the bust is an artist called Anne-Valérie Dupont. So what we know about Henriette de Crans is that she's the first woman sentenced to death for witchcraft in Bessacon. It was in April 1434, so that's a century before our Witchcraft Act came into force. It was a public execution, we know that, and it took place in the park of Chamars, and that's where the actual memorial is. And in total, 800 women were sentenced to death in that region. The accused were, like in Scotland, accused of having made a pact with the devil. A doctor of history, Brigitte Rochelandi, said, "The witchcraft trials are very much linked to violence against women. We chose to exhibit her bust because it is an emblematic victim of misogyny. She represents all the accused." So this professor actively participated to get the public recognition of Henriette de Crans for the bust to be put up. We understand that Henriette de Crans was around 70 at the time of her death, and in fact, that's clearly quite an old person for those times. So if you're ever about in the city of Bessacon and in that particular area, please do go and see the bust of Henriette de Crans. And I think it's great that now in France, people are starting to recognise this as well, because although they've done it a lot more in Germany, and we've got Hartmut Hegeler to thank for that, Herr Hegeler, we haven't seen so many memorials in France. So I think that's really great.
And in fact, I don't think that people maybe realise broadly that there were the same amount of, or a high amount of witch trials and executions across other areas in Europe. I did an event with a writer who of some repute, who is a historic writer, historic fiction, who is really great, and her stuff is very researched. And she insisted that there weren't witch trials in France. And I very politely didn't say anything, but there clearly were. So I think it's something that people don't really talk about all that much.
I was going to say that's not like you, Zoe, very politely not saying something.
I was being professional. I know that it doesn't sound like a very likely thing, but it does sometimes happen.
We have more news as well.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
What's that then?
Well, thank you for sounding as if you don't know what it is in advance. One of our listeners got in contact with us, a listener called Irene Tierney. Hiya, Irene. And she pointed out to us a BBC Social Bite video. And it was about, inverted commas, witches in Scotland, in particular one witch trial. We'll not share it because if you watch it, it was just really sort of spooky and sensationalist. They didn't get the numbers right. They didn't get the number of trials right. They didn't get the number of people who were executed right. And also the piece was as if these people were witches and had made pacts with the devil. So Irene showed us it, and I was pretty appalled by it, I'd have to say. And Irene said, in fact, what she did was she wrote into the BBC to complain about it, or really to flag up what she thought about it. And she said that we could read out her response, which I think is really great. And what she said is, it's unfortunate the way this video has portrayed the history of normal, everyday women and some men. A different way of doing things is advisable, along with giving people a better message than this video gives. There's a wealth of information on what happened during this time in Scotland's history. And if anyone is interested, an excellent resource on this topic, please go to, and she's mentioned us, witchesofscotland.com. Yeah. They have a very informative podcast and are doing great work towards getting a pardon for all accused of witchcraft. Do your research, people. And to the BBC, this is shameful of you, sensationalising the horrors done to these women and men at this time. So thanks very much for that, Irene, and absolutely agree with every word. If you watched it, it's not done in a way which is respectful to those that were killed as witches, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Is that all the news for today?
Yes, I'm literally shuffling my papers to indicate that that's the end of the news.
Claire, do we have some names of people that were accused of being witches this week?
Yes, we do. Thanks very much to Matthew Bridson, who actually supplied us with a list in respect of the Lancashire witch trials of 1612. And he explains to us that there were 21 total arrests, 12 deaths, that being 11 executions and 1 death in prison. The Lancashire witches include the Pendle witches, the Samsbury witches, Isabel Roby, which is a standalone figure from the village of Windle near St Helens. So it includes all of these people. So the names of these people are Alison Device, who was found guilty and executed, James Device, who was found guilty and executed, Elizabeth Device, who was mother of Alison, was found guilty and executed, Elizabeth Southrons, alias Old Demdike, who is the mother of Elizabeth Device, died during her incarceration before her trial. Anne Whittle, aka Chattox, was found guilty and also executed. Anne Redfern was found guilty and executed. Alice Nutter was found guilty and executed. Catherine Hewitt was found guilty and executed. John Bullock, found guilty and executed. Jane Bullock, that's mother of John, found guilty and executed. Margaret Pearson, found guilty and was imprisoned for 1 year and pilloried on 4 market days. So she evaded death but got prison and was put in shackles, I presume, pilloried on 4 market days. And Janet Preston was found guilty and executed. Those who were accused of witchcraft but not executed were Janet Byerley, Ellen Byerley, Jane Southworth, Elizabeth Astley, Alice Gray, Lawrence Hay, John Ramden, Isabel Sidegreaves, and lastly, Isabel Roby, who was found guilty and executed. So that is all the people named there, and we should remember those people as people and not witches.
It's particularly horrible because when you look at them and you look at the ages and the family relations between them, Alison and James Device were kids, basically, between sort of 10 and mid-teens, and they were the child of Elizabeth Device, and their granny, Elizabeth Southerns, Old Demdike, was their she was also executed as well. So that's the mother, the two kids, and the granny. And then we've got the mother and the daughter of Anne Whittle were both killed as well. It's really horrible. Like the thought that that's like a whole family that were wiped out. It's really crazy to think of that. I mean, it's awful any age. Don't get me wrong. I don't think that there's an age that's okay, but the fact that it was like young teens and old ladies as well is just like mind blowing.
And the fact that it would be happening with your family, that, you know, not only that you would be going through it, but members of your family, absolutely horrific. I was listening to another podcast. Sorry, Zoe. I was listening to another podcast.
Oh my God. Rock my world here.
The philosopher Cornel West was on it, and he said the worst thing that you can do to a person is not signify their passing in death, because it's the complete negation of their life. And not remembering people in death is a dehumanizing thing, and that was certainly the case with the people here. There was a published pamphlet which Matthew Bridson brought our attention to about the way some of these people were spoken about and the language used to describe them. And I think, Zoe, you've got a note of some of the way that they were described, and you can see from that they were dehumanizing them. They were making them less than human.
So there's some notes on James Device. So he was one of the first people's names you called out there, and he was found guilty and executed, and he was between the ages of 10 to 15. So just a young kid. And it said about him, this wicked and insensible wretch was so insensible, weak, and unable to speak in all things, as he could neither speak, hear, or stand, but was holden up. It seems that he had tried to, quote, bring himself to some untimely death and thereby to avoid his trial. He's just a kid, you know, it's just so awful. And then his mother, Elizabeth Device, so she was, we don't have an age for her, but she's the mother of these two teens that were executed. And it describes her as being a barbarous and inhuman monster, an odious witch. And when her daughter Janet is brought in as a witness against her family, so Janet survived as the witness, whilst her brother and sister and mother and grandmother were all accused and executed. So Janet was the witness against them, which is just, it's really hard to get your head around how awful that would be. And so when she was brought in, Elizabeth, the mother, was outrageously cursing and cried out against the child in such a fearful manner. I mean, what a crazy idea that whole thing is.
Well, of course, that poor child, Janet herself, is a victim of witchcraft accusations. She's a child and she's being forced to say that her family members are witches.
It's awful. And then we've got some notes as well about Chattox, who is one of the Lancashire Witches. So she was 70 plus. Her real name was Anne Whittle, and she was the mother of Anne Redfern. So she, again, was executed. And the notes that it says about her were a very old, withered, spent and decrepit creature, her sight almost gone, her lips every chattering and walking, but no man knew what. So, I mean, it sounds like she was a wreck of a person. She was so elderly, and it says that her lips were chattering while she was walking, which I presume is them saying that she was maybe talking nonsense, that they couldn't understand what she was saying.
Yeah, I thought when it says her lips every chattering and walking meant that it was like her lips were walking. She was just chattering away.
Yeah, that's sad.
Yeah, you can see the dehumanizing nature of the description of her. Old, withered, spent, decrepit creature, you know, not even accepting the person's humanity.
And then we've got Jane and John Bullock, who were mother and son, and they were described as crying out in a very outrageous manner, even to the gallows. I mean, as if what, you were meant to keep a dignified silence while you were wrongfully accused and then executed. It's appalling. Yeah. Really scary. And then the final little bit of note here is about Isabel Roby, who you mentioned at the top, Claire, was a standalone figure who came from a village called Windle near St Helens. So she wasn't part of the Lancashire Witches, but is often thought of in the same area. And she was described as being a very dangerous witch, feared in all parts of the country. So that was Isabel Roby.
Not so dangerous that she was actually able to help herself in any way when she was accused of witchcraft, or do anything to anybody that might avoid this horrific death.
Dreadful.
Remember all these people as people, not witches.
Yeah, exactly. So now I'm going to introduce our guest today, who is the lovely person that has shared that information with us, and we'll be talking more about that and about his areas of study. So I'd like to welcome to the show Matthew Bridson, who's a postgraduate scholar of heritage studies. He recently submitted his master's thesis on the topic of the group referred to as the Lancashire Witches. So that's obviously who we've just named there. When it comes to management of the stories of historical witches, and he's got that in quotation marks, he feels it's all too easy to fall into the trap of making decisions rooted in unconscious cultural attitudes that depict them as fantastical characters instead of real humans who suffered in unimaginable ways. He believes this not only perpetuates the dehumanizing prejudices of the past, but also unwittingly continues to normalize discriminatory attitudes towards marginalized groups today. His thesis analyzes some of the ways these problematic cultural tendencies manifest around the accused from the Lancashire witch trials. He also proposes interventions that aim to build greater awareness in favour of more humanising approaches that disrupt harmful quote-unquote witch narratives. You can find Matthew on Twitter, so that's at Matthew Bridson, which is spelled Mathew and then Bridson, and on Instagram as at Lancelot Prudence. It was really, really great to have Matthew here. So welcome to the show, Matthew Bridson. Matthew, welcome to our podcast.
Hi guys, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
We're so happy to have you on. Can you tell us, first of all, who you are and what you do? And then maybe you could tell people why it is that we were in contact with each other initially.
Yeah, definitely. So I am a heritage studies scholar. At the moment, I've been working on my master's. And since I was tiny, really, I've always loved witches. My big sister and I used to always just be fascinated by them when we were kids. And my parents, bless them, used to really big up Halloween for us. We used to have a really good time. And yeah, I think it was just something I always enjoyed. Like our VHS copy of Hocus Pocus, the film, was just worn through. It really was. And then growing up, yeah, always just sort of kept that interest. And I think as I got a little bit older, I started to really see the difference in the witches that we're all so used to in terms of culture and popular culture, and then the actual witch hunts historically, and all the suffering that happened there. And I think more and more those two paths sort of diverged, and I started to question, what's actually behind these stories, what's the human story behind these sort of legendary caricatures almost. Which has sort of inspired me really in my studies. But coming to you guys, I've been listening to the podcast since day one pretty much. I think it was the episode about the Salem Museum that prompted me to get in touch. And I wanted to just chat with you guys a little bit more about Tituba, who is the either Indigenous American or potentially Black witch that's sometimes swept under the carpet for loads of different reasons. And that was when we started chatting a little bit more. And I happened to mention that my thesis topic, which is about the Lancashire Witches, which I'll touch on in a sec, was inspired by listening to you guys. So yeah, that's what brought me to you today.
Absolutely amazing. First of all, we want to thank you, Matthew, for getting in contact with us, because you raised an important point about Tituba, which was that she wasn't on one of the lists that we'd read out as witches. So we were appalled that she wasn't on the list and delighted to have raised it and ensured that her name was front and centre on the list. So thank you so much for that. But we're also absolutely delighted to find out that you haven't gone down the path of simply rewatching Hocus Pocus over and over again. but I've actually taken the route of academia to find out about the Lancashire Witches and what they're all about. Can you tell us then how you decided to do your studies? Why did you decide to focus on the Lancashire Witches?
I mean, I'm from the north of England, so I live in Cheshire. Lancashire's only a county or two away.
That's where I'm from. I have to say, full disclosure, I'm from Lancashire.
Amazing.
I know, exciting. Amazing. This is as exciting as it gets in our programme.
No, that's so great. I didn't even realise. That's amazing.
I was born.
Oh, fab. Yeah, so it's really not too far from Cheshire, really. And I've always sort of known of this story of the, it's big capitals, the Lancashire Witches. And I'd never really gone much further than knowing that. I've seen a lot of depictions that have been pulled from things like old books. And again, there are these sort of etchings of these sort of old crones, these old women with the, flying across the moon with the hats on, that sort of thing. And I just wanted to find out more because I knew that they were really infamous. And in terms of England, at least, they're one of the most famous, or maybe the most infamous stories out there. And yeah, I wanted to dive in a little bit more. And for my thesis, the topic is effectively a critical analysis of the discourse around the victims of this trial. And when I say victims, I mean the people that were accused. Because, it's a social injustice. These people weren't really dealing with the devil to curse their neighbours and all of these things. So it's a critical analysis of the discourse around these victims in this landscape, which is, sometimes known as witch country in Lancashire. In day-to-day, that sort of refers to the kind of tourist area and landscape related to the witches in different degrees. But for me, it also, the side of a landscape kind of plays into, the physical geography still, and the way that that sort of physical landscape is constructed, but also the cultural environment and geography there as well, and the way that certain attitudes are kind of built and laid up, particularly with regards to the witches too.
That's fascinating. We spoke to Karen Strang, an artist who was particularly affected by the landscape in relation to the witch trials, and that's a focus of a lot of her work as well. It's so interesting that the physicality of the landscape informs so much of what goes on.
Yeah, that's it. And I remember Karen's episode, and she was really pulling out the sort of effect, the influence that Pendle Hill had on her. And yeah, that's something that, again, I kind of pull into my analysis. So, and when I'm talking about discourse, it's a very sort of fancy word for me to just throw out. But in general conversation, discourse does just mean, I suppose you'd call it a conversation that goes off on a tangent and just kind of propels itself forward on that kind of theme.
That sounds like our entire podcast. So
I cannot comment.
It's an analysis of discourse that does moving off in the wrong direction.
Absolutely. But yeah, so and this sense of what I'm studying, a discourse really refers to, it's a collection of, sort of symbols and signs that you see, again, in this cultural and physical landscape. And it refers to, I suppose, loads of different things. So a sign can be a physical marker or, visual representation. It could be a word. It could be an act or a decision that's been made. Something, basically anything can be a sign as long as it's signifying something and somebody interprets it in that way. And when we talk about discourse, that's basically lots of different signs coming together under one sort of umbrella along the same theme. And what happens when they come together is you tend to get the interpretation of one sign, then creating another sign, which then gets interpreted again and again and again. And what you find is this sort of closed loop of similar attitudes, ideologies, opinions, interpretations that just keeps propelling and self-perpetuating. And yet that's kind of what I talk about a discourse is what I mean by that.
That's interesting the way you describe that. Sounds, you're talking about it, and we'll come obviously to talk about the Pendle Witches, but you're coming to talk about that at that time, those signs. But what it actually sounds like is the very 21st century phenomena of your social media bubble. You see and get a lot of things input, and that informs the other things that you get, and then you get a social media bubble where your world is created of that narrative because it's what you put in and what you receive.
That's exactly, yeah, and that's a really good way of thinking about it. It's things that are sort of receiving all of these concepts and interpretations, but then they're also transmitting them as well. And the important thing to remember in all of this is we are all part of those kind of discourses, but it's always done unconsciously. It's not something that we're normally aware of. And yeah, it's this idea almost of all these different ideologies kind of get normalized and naturalized because we take them for granted as a fact, as just commonplace, and it makes sense to us. Talking about witches, and this is something that you see constantly, so, and this is very much a contemporary thing, the fact that when I say witches, the listeners can't see me do this, but it's always witches. Imagine I've got kind of air quotes going on, because of course these people aren't actually witches, they're just people that, it's like the Orkney Monument says, they're just folk. And it's all these different little things. So it's, it can be words that we ascribe. It can be physical signs. It can be acts and decisions that people make. In somewhere like Lancashire in witch country, you see literally everywhere. It'd be interesting, Zoe, if you notice this as well. The symbol of a witch on a broom is just on everything. So it doesn't matter if it's got anything to do with these historical witches. It's a logo. It's a sign. It's on buses. It's on car dealerships, everything.
I left Lancashire when I was 5, so I don't know if it was as much of a marketing sort of a ploy then in those days. And again, you know, like my family aren't from Lancashire. My dad just sort of landed up there, and that's where we lived there 5 years. So we didn't really have a link there. But I mean, my parents have never said anything to me about it. There was no chat about it. But then maybe just because I was too wee. But, you know, it's like in Scotland, it depends on if you're a part of the discourse, maybe, that you notice these things, if anybody deconstructs things for you. So that's something I think that's been quite interesting for us during doing the podcast, is that there are certain things that we just take for granted, you know, like, so where we live in Fife, you have in some places in really, really old buildings, there's the mark over the door, isn't there, Claire, that I would have seen and wouldn't have really thought anything of particularly. I would have just sort of, my eye would have glided over it probably. And I count myself as being what I would describe as a noticer, you know, like I do notice things, but there are some things that you just go, well, that's just the olden days, and then don't really question it. It's only when we start to do the podcast, it's like, oh, that's to do with witches. That's so much more interesting. So I think that it depends whether you're sort of interrogating what you're seeing as you move through the world, I guess. Mm-hmm. So that's what you were really focusing on, is what we take for granted, and then maybe unpicking that a wee bit. Is that fair to say?
That's right. Yeah, it's me basically trying to pull out all these different, I suppose I tend to call them in my thesis, sort of witch signs in one form or another, and just trying to find out what it is they actually end up doing, why we interpret them in a certain way, what the kind of implications of that are, and then thinking beyond that. So for me, when I'm thinking about those things, I see them as signs that dehumanize the victims of those trials. And I'm then looking ahead to think, okay, other ways that we can address this. And I think more what I really noticed when I was doing the research as well was that it's not just standalone discourse that affects those people from the 17th century and the 1600s. All of those discourses seem related to contemporary things going on as well. And it all seems to link back into people that may be more at risk of discrimination for class, gender, race, religion. It's all still relevant. And I find that some of those signs that are perhaps portraying the witches in similar sort of fantastical ways are also unintentionally, again, it's all unconsciously done, impacting those other groups at risk of marginalisation now.
That's fantastic theory, Matthew. I wonder if you could try and exemplify that with an example of a witch sign. Would you be able to tell our listeners about an example or two?
Of course, yeah. So, I mean, there are loads. I'll definitely try and give you a couple of examples, but one of the big ones for me, and this is, again, thinking back to Karen Strang talking about Pendle Hill. Pendle Hill is this ginormous hill in the landscape. It really stands out. It never actually had anything to do with the story of the Lancashire Witches, which I'll tell you guys a little bit about in more detail later. But it's always just been something that exists there. And it's not until the sort of 20th century that you really start to see these different attitudes towards it changing. So I looked back into, I suppose, the kind of cultural words and things related to the hill. And what really stands out to me, especially in the present day, is how you always see the pairing of the name Pendle Hill with the word brooding. It's always brooding Pendle Hill. You look through the press, you look through all of these different things. It's always brooding away. And I just started thinking, when did it start to brood? Because it can't always have done this. And it always seems so synonymous with the idea of the Lancashire Witches, and people flock there every year at Halloween. There's hordes of people. The police have had to stop people going up there. It's so busy. And again, I was intrigued because from what I knew, it wasn't really linked to the story of all the supposed crimes of these witches. So I sort of delved back into, I thought maybe the literary world, there's something here I need to look at. And in the 1850s, a chap called Ainsworth wrote a book, a fiction, a romance called The Tale of the Lancashire Witches. And in that, it's strange. I thought, well, this must be it. This is where you'll see this really brooding hill going on. But it wasn't. It was just a hill. It was very much in the landscape. It was very much there, but it wasn't necessarily described in that way. But what I thought was interesting was that the witch families involved, who are sort of fictionalized and made into characters in this book, they're also referred to as a brood quite a lot. So a brood of witches. And the only other people, or the only other things that are referred to as a brood in that book are animals. I mean, that word is very much, it reminds me of snakes or, some kind of sort of wild animal in some way. And I thought that is a word that's, I suppose, intentionally animalizing these individuals. But I thought, okay, maybe there's something in the idea of brood that's kind of locked in and then is echoed later on. And then I jumped ahead because there was another quite famous book in the 1950s, which was about the Lancashire Witches in Pendle, and it was called Mist over Pendle. And again, you see similar things of these witch families being called a brood of witches. But what you see for the first time is this idea of Pendle Hill. It's no longer just this inanimate thing in the landscape, this benign kind of geography. It becomes characterized, it's personified. And the author, Robert Neal, describes it as a brooding hill. He gives it this very ominous presence. The protagonist of the book sees it for the first time, finds it really sinister. She feels as though it's almost possessed, that it's watching her. And he calls the chapter of that book The Brooding Hill. And it seems as though, again, this is a great example of discourse. That book has then lodged this interpretation of the hill in the popular mind. And it's just set off on this sort of loop of interpretation and reinterpretation. And you see in the 1970s, book covers of Mist over Pendle have this brooding looking hill on the front. And there's a witch's cottage smack bang in the middle of it. And again, you see then this association of the witches, these people, again, sort of air quotes witches, with the hill. And as those two keep being interpreted in this sort of negative, almost animalized kind of way, they keep supporting each other. And what I noticed was that, it's this idea of a sort of a loss of control, a loss of, I think when people are interpreting that, you see it as something to be feared. It's something that's not quite human, but is in some ways powerful or dangerous. And I found it fascinating how this idea of this brooding hill then becomes synonymous with this idea of these people in this area having been witches. It's almost as though that landscape would inevitably kind of make witches there, if that makes sense.
I was just going to say, while you were talking, I quickly Googled the etymology for the word brood, because I'm an English teacher and I'm told. And it's really interesting, actually. I mean, I've used a brood, or I've had the word brood used to apply to me and my children, because I have quite a lot of, seems to be too many children, to be honest, at times. But it says that is which has been hatched by heat. And one of the things that it's from is from the root brew, BHREU, to boil, bubble, effervesce, or burn.
Boil and trouble.
Yeah, double.
Like that, it's like really interesting the way that all these different words, like they have the original meaning, but then they have all these other things that then attach to them and do build this really strong thing in your head, so that's really strange. Yeah, and brooding is always used, isn't it? It's quite cliched, I suppose. But the whole idea about a brooding mountain, you described
ominous.
The book covers of the 70s, I immediately have a really strong picture of what that looks like. That I've got a very strong 70s vibe of a flowing skirt, the long hair, the brooding mountain, maybe a staff.
Are you thinking of those Hammer House of Horror movies, Zoe?
No, I am thinking of like a woman, like on a brooding hill, about to do a spell, or about to be chased for being accused of doing a spell, It's quite strange. What do you think, Matthew, of like the sort of the modern love of, in some quarters, of witchiness and witch adjacent terminology and decor and all the rest of it? What do you think about that these days?
There's this modern incarnation of witchcraft, or Wicca, for example, but that really is so different to what we're dealing with historically speaking. And I know that some of the early founders of Wicca, people like Gerald Gardner in the 20th century, he was very keen to reiterate this idea of an unbroken line of a witch cult that stretched back into the centuries. And it is a wonderful idea, but it's just not really the case. And I'm so respectful of anyone's religious beliefs that are, to do with paganism or witchcraft. I think it's just having that recognition that to look back and say that some of these people might have identified as witches is just an untruth, because it becomes a slight on them in some ways. In the case of Lancashire, what I recognise more and more is what these individuals were, most likely, were actually persecuted Catholics. So at the time, 1612, we're talking about here, this is King James is set on the throne of Scotland and England. He is terrified of witches. He's got all these plots coming at him left, right and centre. A couple of years before the Gunpowder Plot happened, which was Catholics coming for his Church of England throne. And Lancashire is very much this enclave, if you like, in the wilds of the north, which is seen as very lawless, and a place where Catholicism is still really rife. And even though there are lots of laws that are in place now, again, from this is the time from Queen Elizabeth as well, against the practicing of Catholicism, it's still happening, and people know it's still happening. And all of these individuals seem to be involved in that in some degree. So when they're being persecuted as witches, part of that also is most likely pulling out the fact that, look, these are people practicing rituals as almost an anti-religion here. This is not something that we want. It's too radical, it's dangerous, it's different, and we don't want it.
It's fascinating. I think it's really interesting, and it's something that actually is kind of irksome in some ways. Like, we see there's lots of people that are very supportive of the campaign that we're running to do the apology and the pardon and the state monument. And if I was to do a Venn diagram, there would be some people that would cross over that view themselves as being modern witches. And I think for the most part, people understand the idea that those that were accused and executed as witches, again, I'm doing the air quotes, would absolutely have been horrified for people to now say, oh, and they were witches and we identify with them. And we're, that phrase, I find this really objectionable. We're the granddaughters of the women you burned, or the variation on that. It makes me feel really enraged, because it's so disrespectful to the people that were actually accused and or executed, because they in no way would have viewed themselves as witches. They were generally pretty Christian, weren't they, obviously? And if you're saying here that the case in Lancashire was they were often Catholics, they would have been absolutely horrified by that. So I think that to say that is just, it's such a twist of history. And I think it's coming from a good place, but it's coming from quite an ignorant place. And I think that's one thing we feel quite strongly about on the podcast, is by getting different researchers and academics and historians and people that are experts in their field come on and say, no, this is actually what happened, that people are understanding that a bit more and are thinking about it a little bit in a more joined up way. So it makes me feel sort of enraged on those people's behalf, because I want them to have the dignity of, this was wrong, it was a miscarriage of justice. They weren't stirring cauldrons. There may have been some, we say this every week, and I'm sorry, it's maybe a bit repetitive, but, there may have been some people that were herbalists, or there may have been some people that did charms, and there may have been some people that people would go to if they wanted, like a love charm or whatever. But the fact is, the vast, vast, vast majority were just regular people that were doing something that brought them to negative attention in their community, or they were just a patsy and somebody wanted something from them, or they were diverting attention towards somebody else. So I'm sorry, I'm just going on about this again, but I just think it's really important. So I'm glad to hear you saying that you recognise, obviously through your research, provable, factual, historically accurate, that they were just people.
I would love to hear about the witches, inverted commas. But just before you do, can you give us another example? Because I found that first example so interesting. Is there any other example that you might give us that we can think about?
Another great example, going back to science, sorry, what you're asking for, Claire, that comes to mind in Lancashire, actually. It's an odd one, because although there's so much hype about the witches, particularly in the area around Pendle, which I'll talk about a little bit later with the story, but there's not actually that many places that we know for sure all of these events happened in. There's lots of conjecture, and for other places there's potentially certain scenes or sites where things could have happened, but they're always private. So there's actually not a lot of accessible places to go to learn about the story of the witches or to remember them in any way. One of the places that there is, and this was created in 2012 for the 4th centenary of the witch trials, is something called the Lancashire Witches Walk. And that is set up around a series of 10, they're called tercet waymarkers. And they're basically big iron waymarkers that are scattered through the Lancashire landscape. And they have lines of sort of tercet lines of poetry from Carol Ann Duffy, who was the poet laureate at the time. It was amazing that she was involved, actually. And there's a route that has been tracked that they follow. And it's a mixture of things. So it's partly educated guessing at where some of the accused from Pendle would have walked as they were basically taken to be imprisoned in Lancaster, which is about 51 miles away. Other things, sometimes it's related to some of the sites that come up in their story. So potentially where they're supposed to have met, certain familiar spirits. And then other things are dictated by the fact that there's a limit to where you can walk nowadays, and it could be that certain footpaths cross private land. So all these things sort of come together to create this route, the Lancashire Witches Walk. And it's a really brilliant idea, and I love the beauty of it. It's crossing the moors a lot of the time from the Pendle area to Lancaster. But then in other ways, it can be problematic too. And this is what, when I visited, I came to recognise. So these markers are dotted across the landscape, but so many of them are in quite inaccessible places. It can either be very rural, very isolated. If you're an able-bodied person, it's great, you can find them no problem. But if you're not, if you're someone with any kind of form of disability, it's impossible to get there. And then you're timesing that by the fact that these sort of markers are placed over 51 miles, and the point is you have to follow that route and walk. So you have to do that route if you're physically able to, but then more than that, you have to have the time to be able to walk 51 miles. And in this day and age, to have that leisure time is a privilege, and it's definitely not something that everyone can afford. Something else that cropped up was even just having knowledge about this walk and the route is actually kind of hard. You have to buy a book about the route, but in that book, when it was first published, people complained because there wasn't enough information. So there was another book that was created that sort of sits alongside it. You have to buy those books, and if you can't afford to buy those books, you can't partake in this walk. And there are just all of these sort of various elements that you think, it's in some ways it's out there in the wilds, it's free to get to. In that sense, it's great. And it's designed to help you kind of follow that route and walk in the steps of those victims, which is amazing. But logistically, it throws up these sort of silent decisions and acts that, again, end up ostracizing people at risk of discrimination, which is not dissimilar to what was happening in 1612 as well.
That's an interesting point you make, that if you've got enough money and enough time, and usually only people with money and time are those that are better off, then you can do this. But if you can't, it's a beautiful and brilliant idea, but it might just not be available to the majority of people.
Exactly so. And this all just starts to feel more and more relevant when we're talking about what you guys are doing and thinking about ways, if you were wanting a national monument or memorial, how do we make this accessible, and how do we do things with this to make sure we're not actually othering certain people in the way that those individuals and victims were othered in the early modern period?
I think that's a really, really important point for a national monument. I think a national monument is something which should allow for the greatest degree of accessibility, for it to be as utilitarian as possible, for everybody to see it if they can. I know Zoe feels strongly about that as well.
Yeah, I just think it needs to be something that's just really quite obvious, maybe. I don't mean obvious as in it's a statue of a woman dressed as a witch holding a cauldron. I just mean something that is really accessible.
That would just be wrong, Zoe. That would be the wrong way to remember women killed as witches.
Yet you wouldn't actually be surprised if somebody did think that would be an appropriate statue to have. But just something that's really, that, like you're saying, that it's accessible, that anybody can get there, that it doesn't require a great deal of time. Because I think also that sort of thing, you're already kind of preaching to the choir, so to speak, with something like you're talking about, because like you're saying, you're going to need to have some interest level already to seek that out. Whereas what I think is quite interesting is Claire's kind of origin story of how she got involved and made up the campaign was that it was a chancy thing, that she saw these statues kind of by chance, and then her brain sort of put two and two together and went, hang on, where are the women in this situation? Where is the representation of women? And I think that for me would be the sort of the exciting aspect of a statue like that, would be that people that have no prior interest or knowledge necessarily just see something and then learn something, and then it changes them a little bit. I think that to me is one of the functions of statuary. So that's what personally I'd like to see, something obvious and amazing, so that you look at it and you kind of go, wow, and think about it.
That is completely it. And it's thinking about ways, how can we not make this exclusory? Yeah. How can we bring as many people in as possible to engage with this, and at the same time not unintentionally commit kind of certain acts that are discriminating against people in the way that historically maybe people that are accused of witchcraft have been discriminated against as well?
Matthew, I might ask, someone contacted me quite early on in the campaign and said that there was, I don't know if it was the Witches' Walk that they were referring to, but they said some of the signposts to it were done with pointy hats and the inverted commas Halloween witch look. And they were appalled at this because effectively what you were doing was showing people that had been killed. Was that the Witches' Walk they were talking about?
Yes, there's sort of a mix actually, because I'd never been to Lancashire or that area of Lancashire before I was doing my research, so I went on a field study there. I mean, it was a little bit of a holiday for me, but it was actually a study. So I got to go around and walk around these hills and go, oh, it's amazing, amazing. But I was doing research too. And when I was there, yeah, I was this exactly right. I was seeing all of these signs everywhere, and it was a little bit weird because a lot of them are not actually always pointing towards this walk. Sometimes they're just pointing to what you might just want to call it witchy areas. So there's not really anything to go to see there because there's no official site or memorial or anything. But you just see this witch with a pointy hat on a broom, on a wooden sign, and it's just pointing that way. So you just follow. And then there are other signs for the Lancashire Witches' Walk itself, and they're slightly different. So they're kind of white arrows, that have a kind of footpath sign shape to them. But on that, instead of the witch on the broom, you just see a sort of wizened face of an old woman in a bonnet.
Oh, no.
And again, it's hard because I think what people have tried to do is say, look, how do we make this visually recognizable as witch, right? People want to see Witches' Walk. But then I think it's undermining the point of the walk for me. Yeah, very strange one. It's similar. It was an interesting actually thing too. I ended up visiting Lancaster. And that's the town where all of the Lancashire witches were imprisoned and tried and executed, all bar one anyway, because she was actually just over the border, so she had to be tried in York. And at Lancaster Castle, it's thought that there were 2 dungeon cells originally. One of them was removed in the, I think it was 18th or 19th century, because the castle is actually a prison now. And it was a prison until about 2014. So there is 1 dungeon cell remaining. And they think, I mean, it's a 50-50 chance that this was actually the cell where the Lancashire witches would have been imprisoned. But it's not accessible to the public. And I spoke to the Duchy of Lancaster, and they're the people that are responsible for the running of the castle. And I spoke to them about it a little bit. And they said that challenge is getting accessibility down there because there is nothing there. I was really fortunate. They allowed me access to it. There is no lighting. There is no kind of easy access into that sort of space. So it's below ground. It's beneath a structure that's called the Witches' Tower, after the Lancashire Witches. And the chap there, when I walked in, gave me a hard hat and a lantern and sort of ushered me down these steps towards this cell.
On your own?
On my own.
Oh my God, that's so scary.
It is scary. But do you know what? I was really keen to do it because I wanted to get this sense of, right, what is this? This is a site that is actually linked to this history. It's a definite place, and I want to know how that makes me feel as a visitor. Like what engagement, what kind of impression is it giving me? I went in, and it's such a harrowing space. I can't really explain it. It's a tiny sort of cell space with a kind of arched, it's almost like a ship has been overturned, so it's got this sort of arched ceiling to it with these very jagged and rough walls. It's very dank. It's incredibly dark. There are no windows. There's no light coming in, and the only light that there is comes from the very top of the stairs that I came from. And when I turned off my lantern, there was darkness. It was pitch black, and it was really scary. But what I thought was most interesting, that it was just incredibly sad, because I imagine these people being incarcerated there for months. And I'll talk a little bit how long they were there when I sort of tell you the story of the witches properly. But it was really haunting. For me. And I thought it was such a shame that for whatever reason, currently there is no sort of long-term access to this space. But the only exception to that is there are 2 things. If there are private paranormal groups that get in touch with the Duchy, they are allowed access. And something that's happened for the last couple of years, COVID aside, is the Lancashire Witches Festival. And during that time, the cellars opened up with ticketed sort of limited space. And an actor goes down there posing as one of the more famous individuals from the Lancashire Witches, telling the story of her supposed crimes. And what I saw with the marketing imagery for that is, well, sort of young women who had been dressed in sort of ragged looking clothes with wizened faces, and they were either on the steps to the cell or sort of crouched down sort of menacingly in the cell itself. And I just found it really troubling. I thought, this is such a powerful space and a rare space that we have this. It's very likely this is where these events happen, these horrible things, which would really humanize the people we're talking about here. And it ends up being this sort of unintentional pantomime that kind of commodifies them. It makes them sort of caricatures.
I was just going to say, like, as a parallel, because we've sort of commodified this over the years, you couldn't imagine that there would be an equivalent, say, about the Holocaust or about, say, slavery, where you would have people, oh God, I would really hope not. I really hope this doesn't exist, where you'd have people dressed up and it was like a festival of the Holocaust, or do you know what I mean? Like, I think there is place for people such as yourself that are doing historical and serious research to go and look at places like that. But I think that once you let the public in for things like that, it does have a kind of a carnival sort of an aspect to it, and it's kind of gross. I don't approve of it. I don't want to sound like a total moaning Minnie, but I don't think it's cool. I just think it's really tasteless, and I think it just further takes away the dignity of the people that have long been dead.
I think the problem is the duality of our fascination with the idea of witches and witchcraft. And, who isn't interested in that? And as a child, of course, we're all interested in it. Matthew, you explained yourself that fascination with the idea. But as adults, we should really try and separate that out from what happened to people. The stories of witches are interesting. I love hearing about witches in fiction, stories of witches, as long as we're clear that they are separate from the stories of innocent people who suffered terrible miscarriages of justice. So I don't mind magic and the stories of magic, and indeed I'm interested in them myself. And through this podcast, I think Alice Tarbuck has said, you do rituals, although you're not religious. You've got somewhere where you put things on a mantelpiece and showed me I've got a ritual there. So it's not that I don't like. It's the problematic way that we're dealing with people who suffered an absolutely horrific fate. And we're not thinking about what happened to them. We're thinking of them as witches. And that's what's problematic.
And that's exactly the problem. And there's something in the fact that all of these things happened beyond living memory. And that almost makes it so much easier to just invest in that sort of fantastical, phantasmagorical sort of thrill of it all. But yeah, this is what it's doing. And again, it's not just sort of stigmatizing, almost normalizing this sort of attitude and thinking towards the victims as witches. It's also got this element of sort of carceral violence, and it's making that sort of theatre and pantomime of people being imprisoned, and which is still something happening now. It just sort of continues, perpetuates that thinking. And again, those decisions to, for whatever reason, limit the access to that site and approach the sort of marketing of this event in a certain way, those decisions and acts are signs in themselves, and that just continues this perpetuation, especially with someone like the Duchy of Lancaster, because they have authority in who they are, and by doing those things they're legitimating that thinking. So someone that's sort of knows about the witches, doesn't know much, you come in, you see these pantomime caricatures, you go, oh, okay, yeah, maybe that is the case, or maybe they were witches, maybe that, I'm not sure, and it just normalizes that thinking.
Absolutely. Well, Matthew, we have touched on the story of the Pendle Witches so much. I wonder now, and I appreciate I'm asking you to put a huge story into something which is much more condensed, but I wonder if you could tell us in brief the story of the Pendle Witches.
Yeah, I'll try my best. Within the story of the Lancashire Witches, you do have the Pendle Witches. You also have a few other people, and they all kind of get mixed up and confused a lot of the time. But there are three almost groups. So you have the Lancashire Witches. Beneath that, you have the Pendle Witches. You have the Samlesbury Witches, and you have one individual called Isabel Roby, who was from somewhere completely further away in Lancashire. And they're all tried at the same sort of time, and they're all tried for witchcraft. Isabel Roby, briefly, she was accused, or effectively some of her neighbours said they'd quarrelled with her. She was, again, a quarrelsome dame. These words come up. And purely after that, they felt a little bit sick. Some of them felt unwell, and they accused her of witchcraft against them, and she was arrested. No one died. There was no other witnesses. She didn't sort of admit to anything, but she was executed purely on that. It was seen as a felony that she was conjuring up these wicked spirits. You also have within the Lancashire Witches a group called the Samlesbury Witches, and within them you have around about 8 people. 3 of them were arraigned before a judge, and they were called Janet Byerley or Beerley, Ellen Beerley, and Jane Southworth. And they were accused of having bewitched a young woman called Grace Sowerbutt and made her body sort of consume and waste away. 2 of those women were actually her aunt and her grandmother. So whatever had gone on there, that's what happened. But during the trials, it came out that the defendants said, look, please, can you just, look further into this and question Grace some more? And when they did that, it came out that actually Grace had been supposedly put up to the accusations by a Catholic priest. Supposedly, anyway. And when that happened, everything fell through, the trial fell apart, and there were 5 of the people that had been arrested and indicted but not arraigned just yet, and all of them were acquitted.
Thank goodness some sense prevailed in that at that point.
Well, exactly. And you would think, actually, look, this is the court seeing that this thing is a sham, it's not working out. But in other people's eyes, this was them saying, actually, it's only because we know exactly right and wrong. We know who's lying. We know who really is a witch here, so don't worry about it. We know our stuff. Sadly, it's not that they were astute and doing anything else. Some people even think that could have even been a sort of a ruse, and that was planted there to say, again, look, this thing happened. It was a Catholic that did it because Catholics, awful. However, we're going to try some other witches, and when we try them, we are going to know they're witches because we know what we're doing. And then that helps us move on to the Pendle Witches. And I should say the reason we know all of these things in the first place is because the clerk of the court, I won't name because I think he probably gets enough attention elsewhere, he wrote a pamphlet about all of these proceedings, which was published in London later that year, and it was called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster. And it's not proceedings in the way Claire especially, probably think of them now. These are sort of sensationalized tellings of what was happening, and you hear testimonies from witnesses and people that were accused, but they're all sort of third person. So the statements were written down by a magistrate. The magistrate then gave those statements to the clerk, and the clerk interpreted them. So we never really get a true glimpse of all of the people involved's voices. We can only sort of get snatches of information. But then this leads us onto the Pendle Witches. I mean, it's a really convoluted one, but effectively the most famous thing that sparked it was a young girl called Alison Devitts was walking along one day. She was walking to the town of Colne, comes across a peddler called John Law and asks him to buy some of his pins. He refuses, walks on, and it's at that moment that in some way or other she curses John Law, whether it's saying something, hurling abuse, whatever that is. John Law walks on a couple of steps, and then the horrible timing of this, he falls down, has some sort of a fit, becomes lame on one side, and he is convinced he's been genuinely cursed. Alison is horrified because she goes, oh my goodness, I've just cursed this poor man. And what we probably see now is that the symptoms that he had, becomes lame, finds it difficult to speak. Sounds like he had a stroke. But at the time, no, it was clearly this, what happened. So Alison's dragged before the local magistrate, questioned, interrogated, and she admits, she's obviously racked with guilt, she admits to what happened. And for some reason, we don't know whether it was leading questions, something else, she admits that a spirit, a black dog, came to her and said, look, what would you have me do to this man? And she says, lame him. Runs down, he's lamed. She's so repentful for all this. And as she's telling him, the magistrate, all these things, it comes out that her grandmother in some way is linked to perhaps some kind of magic. She deals with familiars in some way. And from there, this sort of witch hunt ends up sort of barreling away, and different members of the community, families, all become involved. And it's so difficult to understand how much people are admitting, how much these are, third person recountings of people's confessions. But all of these things come out. So her grandmother confesses for having been a witch for 20 years and dealing with all of these different spirit familiars that they have, who are all given names. They come in the form of hares and dogs and young boys, all these different things. And they're all quite scary. So the encounters that they talk about, they're sort of jostled and harassed until they submit to these spirits who are saying, look, let us feed on a part of you, drink blood, and then the pact is through, and we'll do, give you all these abilities and whatever. And they sort of say, look, I pushed him off for a long time. I didn't want this. I was made blind by one of them. I was attacked, all these things. But it's not good enough, because I think that perhaps whether or not they're buying into this story to say, oh, actually, yeah, there was a spirit, but it's okay because I said no and I didn't want to and I repent. It just didn't work. It just incriminated them more and more. So loads of members of the family were rounded up at different times. You had Alison, her grandmother, her neighbour as well, called Chattox, were all dragged to Lancaster Castle and imprisoned. And then a little bit later, Alison's brother James was interrogated. And bear in mind, these are all really kids. Alison's a teenager, James is early teens, max. Their young sister, Janet, is about 9. They're questioned. And this bizarre story comes out where shortly after everyone had been arrested, there was a gathering at this house called Malkin Tower, where the grandmother lived. And supposedly it was a gathering of witches, and they were plotting to blow up Lancaster Castle, release these people, kill the jailer, all these awful things. But this is at a time when obviously the gunpowder plot had just happened. This pamphlet is dedicated to a courtier who actually was the person who found Guy Fawkes under Parliament, ready to blow up. So you see all these sort of things coming through. And anyway, more members of the family, James included, are dragged to prison. They're all indicted for these different sort of accusations of witchcraft that come out, deaths that have happened, all these things, even from years ago in the past. And what's probably most shocking for a lot of people and why the story sticks out is because Janet Devis, who's about 9, is called up as a witness in court and denounces her family. She, for whatever reason, whether it's being led, persuaded, harassed, bullied into doing it, she does it. She denounces her mother, her brother, her grandmother, their neighbours, all of these different people. And essentially, they're all found guilty and they're hanged the next day in Lancaster. We don't know what happened to their bodies. In England, burning wasn't really a thing, so they were more so just hanged. Their bodies could have been tossed in a pit or something else, but that is the story, and that's how it happened. And because of the pamphlet, that's really why we know all of this. Otherwise, it probably would have been lost to some degree. The challenge is that the pamphlet paints all of these individuals as witches. They're rotten, they're wicked. Some of them have maybe, they're decrepit, I should say. They've got sort of facial, what might be sort of classed as a deformity, sort of squints in their eyes, that kind of thing. And you see again these examples of discrimination. So whether it's religion, it's gender, 80% of the people that were arrested were women. All of these things sort of come into play and are still relevant now.
Oh, it's a horrible story, and it's relatively well known in that when people get in touch, often Pendle witches are mentioned. It's one of the big ones, isn't it? But it's just horrible to hear all the detail of that. It's just so unpleasant. And the fact that it's doing things that we obviously, well, I say obviously, I'm hoping what I'm about to say it doesn't happen, that we wouldn't do now, like, using a 9-year-old as a pivotal witness like that. And, or Claire's making big eyes there. Not in Britain, surely.
Well, yeah, young children can still be used as witnesses in cases.
But they're liars and lunatics. Everybody knows that about small children.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's a teacher talking.
I love them, but I wouldn't,
I mean, there are real difficulties, I think. Obviously, if crimes occur against children, then children need to be able to tell their...
Just clarify, I'm not saying that children are all liars, and obviously, if children have to give witness statements about stuff they've seen or experienced, like obviously, I think maybe more what I'm saying is that a whole case wouldn't rest upon a 9-year-old going and see all that I'm related to. They're all witches, and that'd be the end of it. I would imagine there would be a more rigorous approach now.
No, if we were talking about a 9-year-old being an independent witness to something, where you had other adults that could be independent witnesses, the Crown would no doubt elect to call the adults and not require a child to give evidence. But children give evidence as complainers routinely. But if they're not complainers in cases, it would be sensible not to have to go to a child witness, most of all just to put them through the horror of it. I mean, the child that gave evidence in this case was 9. Now, that child cannot have understood in any way what saying these things would have resulted in for their family. They wouldn't have been able to even understand it. Had they even been told, they wouldn't compute what that.
And also, what were they given or promised? How were they treated? Was it sort of an excess of kindness that they weren't used to? Were they sort of almost like a celebrity, or were they treated really poorly? Or I think, now I'm not sure if I'm remembering if it's this book, because I've obviously read quite a lot of witch fiction over the last couple of years, but I think maybe, was it Familiars by Stacey Hall? Maybe. I think there's a child witness in that one, possibly. It's ringing a wee bell. But like the idea that a child would be kind of buttered up basically and told like, oh, you're good, you're the good one. Now tell us about the evil that you're unfortunately surrounded by, and then we'll help you to escape from the evil. That'd be pretty alluring to 9-year-old. I would imagine, especially if they were poor, if they were being promised, to be taken out of poverty in some way. Oh, it's horrid.
And we don't really know, in contrast to a lot of the witches in Scotland, it's obvious that torture was involved. It's not apparent, particularly that this is the case in Lancashire, but we know that people were questioned at the home of the magistrate, interrogated in some way. It could be persuasion, it could be kindness, it could be threats, it could be all of these things. Like you said, poor Janet, she's 9. She has no idea what she's saying. Her whole family, she didn't have, her dad wasn't around. It was just her grandmother, her mum, her 2 siblings. They're gone. All of them gone. Her 2 older siblings, still children themselves, they're executed. It's just a horrendous story. And with the fame that came from the pamphlet, that sort of case was then used around about 80 years later with Salem. Again, it was all these kids coming out saying all of these things, and they were trusted, and there were no questions asked. And it's caused this sort of horrible avalanche that's just, it spirals. It's the same way with discourse, it just spirals out of control.
It reminds me also of the story of Christian Shaw, of the Bargaran witches. That was a child as well. Again, either deciding for themselves to tell a story which just got out of control, or being persuaded to it, or being signed up for someone else's story. You never know, but it's a terrible, terrible burden to have left on that child. And I wonder, does history record what happened to her at all?
It doesn't. And the problem with so many of them, we know that a lot of them lived in poverty in some way. You only have very scant parish records. It might be people, it might be not. Some people think around about 20 years later, there was another sort of case of witches in the area, which ended up actually kind of falling through because they were carted off to London. And at that time, central government started saying, hold on, we don't quite believe this is the case. So they were a lot more skeptical. Now, one of those people was called Janet Devitt. It's possible it could have been her, but then there's other evidence suggesting that maybe it wasn't, because it seems as though she was possibly conceived out of wedlock to another family. And there was a girl called Janet Sellers, who it's possible that the family she sort of may have been actually linked to had died a few years before that. So it could well have been her. The point is, and that's probably the most heartbreaking thing of all of this, we don't really know. We don't have those voices of those people. We don't have their input. All we have is this very biased information that's come down through the people that were authority figures that were doing this. So the bias is crazy, really.
Matthew, we are so grateful to you for coming and speaking to us today. I could go on speaking to you for hours and hours, and hopefully at some point in the future, perhaps when your thesis comes back, you might give us an opportunity to have a look at it and perhaps speak to you again about some of the issues in it, because I think the idea about signs that you raise is particularly fascinating, and perhaps maybe in the future you would agree to come back and speak to us at a later stage.
Of course, there's a million things I haven't talked about. So if you guys aren't sick of me yet, please, whatever you want to, I'll be back.
Oh, that'd be great.
Great, we would really, really love that. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem. It's a pleasure. And again, thank you so much. It's wonderful just putting faces to the voices that I've heard so often as well. So thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us again on the Witches of Scotland podcast. We are delighted to keep bringing this top quality content to you, And hopefully, as we keep pushing on with our campaign and with our drive for an apology and a pardon and ultimately a national state monument, you'll come along with us on that journey, or you'll keep traveling with us on that journey. It's hard to believe, Claire, that we've been doing this for so long now.
I know.
And that's got to be, 10, 11 years that we've been doing this for?
Yeah, I mean, I can't even remember. We started in September last year, so that's definitely over a year.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of...
I still had my own teeth at the beginning.
Now I have your teeth.
I hope they're working out okay. I'm really sick of soup and custard, I tell you.
Yeah, so we started off, in fact, now we're coming up close to having one episode for every week of the year.
Well, that's nice.
Yeah.
If that's your thing. That's good. So keep listening and keep getting in touch with us on all our different areas. So we've got our Facebook page, which isn't really for chatting on, but people do get in touch with us via Messenger on there, and that's really useful. Or on our Instagram, or on our YouTube channel. You can watch some content on there. Or the best place to have a bit of a chat with us is on Twitter, because we're on there far too much. And we find out all sorts of weird and wonderful things there. And it's really nice to talk to some of our listeners on there too. Now, I would mention this point as well. We have our merch. We are getting closer to December, at which point I will pronounce the C word in its entirety. Exciting promise there. But we would recommend, if you wanted to, that you had a look at the merch there, because remember that any money we make from the merch goes towards lovely David, Claire's brother, who has been roped in against anybody's better judgment to sound edit this every episode. And as I mentioned at the top, this is episode 47 of 6. So we are really pushing David to his endurance here. If you want to buy him a coffee, we've also got a link there for a thing where you can buy him the price of a coffee, which would be very nice, because David is doing a lovely thing for us by editing this and making it sound slightly better than it actually does in real life.
Slightly better, Zoe.
I don't want to do us down too much. I don't want people to think that we've got like a kind of an audio filter. Do you know what I mean? Like an Instagram filter that makes us sound more intelligent.
Okay. I mean, he can't make us sound any better, but he can definitely make us sound a lot less worse.
Are you actually paid for your speeches and things? Did you just say he could definitely make us sound a lot less worse? International human rights lawyer, Claire Mitchell QC.
Thank you.
I think it's because it's a storm tonight. So we're recording during Storm Arwen. So I think it's a bit wild and crazy outside. So join us next time, and please be in touch. And well, I'm not going to tell you who the next guest is. You'll have to just tune in and find out.
Okay. I love the idea that you think people tune in.
We'll do tune in on a big radio.
With just one knob at one side and another
knob
at the other.
I actually just acted out turning the knob and tuning it into Witches of Scotland. Are you joking? That's how people are listening to this. In front of a fireplace. Bye.
Bye. If you'd like to learn more about the Witches of Scotland, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list at www.witchesofscotland.com to keep updated with the campaign. On that site, you'll be able to find how to link with us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.